After the birth of our 2 children, it felt as if my whole world had shifted. My husband, once my partner in everything, who used to shower me with attention and warmth, now seemed consumed by his work. His affection, once so freely given, had become something rare and fleeting. He would spend a few moments with the kids, laughing as he ruffled their hair or tossing them in the air until their giggles filled the room. But those moments were short-lived. Just as quickly, he would slip away, retreating back to his office or hunched over his laptop, his focus sinking into screens, spreadsheets, and deadlines. His gaze, which once found me across the room in a crowded place, now seemed fixed on glowing monitors, as though the family bustling around him was part of a distant world. Each time I watched him walk away, my chest tightened, a dull ache blooming where his attention used to fill me with joy. I remember the way he used to look at me, like I was the only person in the world. The light in his eyes when we were newly in love, the spark that made me feel cherished, seemed to have faded, replaced by a worn look of exhaustion and distraction. I could almost feel that version of us slipping away, like sand slipping through my fingers, the memories of laughter, spontaneous kisses, and whispered secrets growing fainter by the day. I wanted so desperately to tell him, to reach out and pull him back to me, to find the man who once couldn't go a day without holding my hand. But fear gripped me. Fear that saying these things out loud would somehow widen the gap, making my loneliness real in a way I couldn't ignore. I wondered if he felt this distance too, or if he had become blind to it, too wrapped up in his responsibilities to notice. I longed for the ease we once had, the comfort of his steady presence, and the feeling that I was seen and loved. I wanted to feel important to him again, to feel the warmth of his attention, like sunlight after a long, cold night. But instead, I found myself standing on the edge of that growing void, too afraid to reach out, hoping somehow he would see me again. In our home, we had a house help, a quiet, steady presence who moved through each day with calm efficiency. He worked hard, taking care of the tasks that kept our household running smoothly, and for the longest time, he was just another part of the background. I barely noticed him beyond the work he did. He was diligent, completing each chore without complaint, and we compensated him well for his efforts. But beyond a polite good morning or thank you, we had never shared any personal conversation, any real connection. In my mind, he was simply there to do his job, and that was the extent of my attention. But then, something shifted. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, with small, offhand comments he made. I noticed how, as he went about his duties, he would pause for just a moment to look at me, offering a genuine smile and say something kind. A simple compliment on my dress, a soft pink one I wore on busy mornings when I needed something comfortable yet put together, or a remark about my hair when I had taken the time to smooth it back and add a touch of gloss. These were little observations, the kind I desperately wished my husband would notice. Each time he spoke, his words were gentle, respectful, his tone warm yet casual. But those words lingered with me long after he had gone back to work. At first, I brushed it off. Hearing these things from him didn't quite fill the ache I felt from my husband's growing distance. But, strangely, as the days passed, I found myself looking forward to those small moments. Each compliment touched a part of me that had long been ignored, and it started to mean more to me than I wanted to admit. I began to linger on those words, replaying them in my mind. His kind remarks took on a weight they probably never should have, and suddenly, his presence was no longer part of the background. For weeks, his compliments trickled in, small but persistent, like drops slowly filling an empty cup, stirring something in me that had been quiet for far too long. It started with simple words, innocent, almost casual remarks about my dress or a new hairstyle. At first, I dismissed them, brushing them off as friendly, polite gestures. But as the days slipped by, I found myself waiting for those small moments, for the warmth of his words that seemed to brighten my day in a way I hadn't felt in so long. Soon, I began to notice him in ways I hadn't before. His presence lingered, more solid and real than it had been in the background of my life. When he moved around the house, I couldn't help but watch how his strong hands skillfully handled each task, how he seemed to glide through the rooms with a quiet ease. His broad shoulders, the way his shirt hugged his back as he reached for something high, his steady movements, they all drew my attention. The kindness in his eyes, that soft look he wore when he noticed I was tired or needed help, stayed with me. It was a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I didn't plan it, but slowly, my mind began to wander into places I hadn't allowed myself to go in a long time. I found myself stealing glances, thinking about how it might feel if those hands reached out to hold mine, if his arms wrapped around me in a brief embrace. I imagined the warmth of his touch, the brush of his hand across my back, and the softness of his voice whispering words meant just for me. I pictured his face close to mine, his breath warm, his eyes holding a depth I longed to explore. The thought of a stolen kiss, a shared moment of closeness, flickered in my mind, like forbidden scenes from a daydream I didn't want to leave. I tried to shake off these thoughts, to push them back to where they came from. But each time we found ourselves alone in the house, the kids at school, my husband buried in work elsewhere, the thoughts returned, creeping in like shadows filling a room at dusk. The space between us felt charged, filled with a tension I couldn't name but felt in every fiber of my being. One afternoon, when the kids were at school and my husband was at work, the house was enveloped in a rare, calm silence. The only sound was the steady, low hum of the air conditioner gently cooling the kitchen, creating a stark contrast to the intense heat outside where the sun blazed down mercilessly. Inside, however, the air was crisp and refreshingly cool, and as I stirred a pot on the stove, I found myself fully absorbed in the moment, savoring the quiet. Every small movement felt magnified, from the soft clinking of utensils to the faint, savory aroma wafting from the simmering food. Standing just a few steps away was the house help, his presence usually so subtle that I hardly noticed him at all. But today, his quiet movement seemed amplified, and every glance I stole in his direction stirred something unfamiliar within me. He was focused, silently assisting me with small tasks, a bowl handed over here, a vegetable washed there. His fitted shirt hugged his frame in a way that drew my attention, clinging to his broad shoulders and accentuating his strong, lean build. It was as though I was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. Each time I let my eyes drift in his direction, my heart raced just a little faster, a warmth creeping up my cheeks. My hands moved on autopilot, stirring, chopping, and organizing, but my mind was elsewhere, swept up in thoughts I hadn't anticipated. He seemed completely unaware of the effect he was having, his gaze never wavering from his work, but his quiet confidence only fueled the thoughts building in my mind. Images played out vividly in my imagination, my pulse quickening with each one, leaving me feeling exhilarated and guilty all at once. I busied myself with stirring the pot, chopping vegetables, anything to keep my hand and mind occupied. But my thoughts kept drifting back to him, standing only a few steps away, his presence filling the room in a way that felt almost magnetic. Every small movement he made seemed amplified, the way he wiped down the counter, the quiet sound of his breathing, the faint, earthy scent of his cologne lingering in the air. I could feel my heart picking up speed, my pulse racing as the thoughts I'd been trying to bury started bubbling up, impossible to ignore. The urge grew, tugging at me more strongly than I wanted to admit. I called his name softly, a simple, quiet request, and he glanced over, curious and unsuspecting. He stepped closer, his expression neutral, ready to help, his dark eyes meeting mine. I could feel my chest tightening as he approached, every detail about him suddenly sharper. The fit of his shirt against his toned arms, the warmth radiating from him as he stood close enough that I could feel his breath, soft and steady. Before I had time to reconsider, I reached out, my hand trembling as I pulled him towards me, feeling the firmness of his shoulder under my fingers. And then, without another thought, I pressed my lips against his, hard and fast, letting all the tension I'd been holding back release in that single touch. His lips were warm and unexpectedly soft, catching me off guard. And for those few seconds, everything around us seemed to blur, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. It lasted just 5 seconds, but in those moments, I felt an intensity that took my breath away, a release of every ounce of loneliness and longing I had bottled up. When I pulled back, his eyes were wide, his face a mix of shock and bewilderment, as if he was trying to piece together what had just happened. I could see questions forming in his gaze, confusion shadowing his expression. But as I looked at him, my heart pounding with both fear and desire, I felt an overwhelming pull for more, a craving that now seemed insatiable. Without a word, I reached for him again, drawn by a pull I could no longer ignore. This time, he didn't hesitate. His arms encircled my waist, his grip firm, grounding me yet filling me with an exhilarating sense of freedom. His hands were warm, their hold gentle but strong, pressing me closer to him. I could feel the steady beat of his pulse under my fingertips, each beat matching the wild rhythm of my own heart. It was like an electric spark had passed between us, igniting a fire that had been smoldering for too long. Every nerve in my body felt alive, vibrant, as if a part of me that had been hidden away was waking up, finally breaking free. My hands moved instinctively, sliding down the curve of his back, feeling the tension in his muscles, the warmth of his skin under my touch. His breath brushed against my neck, hot and quick, sending a shiver down my spine. My fingers found their way to his chest, where I could feel the rise and fall of his breath, steady yet intense. The walls of the kitchen seemed to fade away, the world beyond us disappearing into a hazy blur, leaving only the two of us in that moment. Our clothes fell away, piece by piece, each discarded layer breaking down the barriers that had kept me distant, kept me yearning. I felt the coolness of the kitchen air on my bare skin, contrasting sharply with the warmth radiating from his body pressed against mine. My senses were heightened, every touch, every movement a vivid sensation. His skin against mine felt almost surreal, as if I was dreaming, and yet I had never felt more awake. In that brief time, everything else faded. The loneliness I had carried for so long, the ache of feeling unseen and forgotten, melted away under the intensity of his touch. All the frustration and longing I had buried deep inside surfaced, but it no longer felt painful. It was replaced by something undeniably real and grounding. Wrapped in his arms, I felt weightless, alive, and undeniably wanted, as if I was whole again. For those fleeting moments, I forgot everything. Where I was, what I was risking, even who I was supposed to be. All that mattered was the here and now, and the pleasure so overwhelming that it made the entire world outside dissolve into nothingness. But the moment was shattered in an instant. Just as his hands moved to pull me closer, the familiar creak of the front door opening cut through the air. It was a sound so ordinary, yet in that moment, it felt like thunder crashing through the silence. My heart lurched, a jolt of icy fear spreading through me as I realized what it meant. My husband was home, early. I could almost feel the blood drain from my face, my pulse pounding loudly in my ears. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching painfully as the footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the kitchen. Every detail around me sharpened in that sudden panic. The coolness of the air from the AC, the faint smell of the food still simmering on the stove, the gentle light filtering in through the kitchen window. All these ordinary things felt surreal, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. I glanced at the house help, who was as frozen as I was, his eyes wide with shock and fear. We didn't speak, but I knew he felt the same urgency, the same dread. A wave of panic shot through me, sharp and cold, as I frantically grabbed for my clothes, my hands trembling. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I pulled my shirt over my head, my fingers fumbling with each button as if they'd forgotten how to move. I felt clumsy, exposed, like my every move was too loud, too obvious. Beside me, the house help was in a similar state, his usually steady hands now shaking as he hurriedly pulled on his clothes. His face was pale, his wide eyes darting toward the doorway, filled with a blend of fear and disbelief. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. We were each lost in our own panic, desperate to fix what was already shattered. Then, from down the hall, the unmistakable sound of my husband's footsteps echoed closer, each step a weighted beat that seemed to crush the air from my lungs. They were steady, unhurried, but somehow they felt louder with each step, like the ticking of a clock counting down. The noise felt like it was creeping into the kitchen, filling the space and tightening around me like a vice. Every inch of me was braced for the inevitable moment he would appear. When he finally reached the doorway, I could barely bring myself to look up. But when I did, I saw him standing there, his frame tense, his face hard and closed off. His mouth was set in a tight line, and he stood rigid, as if every muscle in his body was holding back from an explosion. His eyes, however, told me everything I needed to know. They were dark, intense, filled with a cold, piercing anger that cut straight through me. There was no softness, no trace of the man I once knew, only a cold realization that he had seen enough to understand. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any shout could have been, filling the room with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. There was no question in his eyes, no flicker of confusion, only a raw, unfiltered anger that told me he knew exactly what had happened. And in that moment, I knew there was no undoing what he had just witnessed. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the kitchen, absorbing every detail of what he had just walked into. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle pulsed at the side of his face, a small but unmistakable sign of the anger barely held in check. His eyes were dark, stormy, a mixture of disbelief and cold fury, darting between me and the house help, piecing together the scene. The silence was thick, suffocating, each second stretching unbearably as my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. Finally, he turned to the house help, his expression hardening even more. When he spoke, his voice was colder than I had ever heard, devoid of the warmth it once held for me. "Get out," he said, the words sharp and cutting, slicing through the heavy air. The house help froze for a moment, as if waiting to make sure he had heard correctly, before he nodded quickly, casting one last, fleeting glance my way, a mixture of regret, fear, and uncertainty flickering across his face. Without another word, he rushed out of the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving me alone to face my husband. As the door clicked shut behind him, the reality of the moment settled over me like a crushing weight. I stood there, feeling painfully exposed, every inch of me laid bare, as though there was nowhere to hide, no corner of this kitchen that could shield me from the consequences of my actions. My husband's gaze bore into me, his eyes no longer warm and familiar, but filled with a deep hurt that pierced through me. There was betrayal in his eyes, yes, but something even heavier lingered there, a sadness, a wounded disbelief that made my chest tighten. He took a slow step toward me, his shoulders rigid, his movements controlled but tense, as though he was holding back a flood of emotions. He stared at me, his voice low, barely a whisper, but each word carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. "How long?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, the hurt unmistakable in its quiet tone. It wasn't an angry demand, but a broken plea, a question he seemed almost afraid to know the answer to. My mouth opened, a dozen explanations, apologies, and excuses hovering on the tip of my tongue, but none of them found their way out. I was paralyzed, my words failing me, as the reality of what I had done settled in, cold and unforgiving. There was nothing I could say, no excuse that could undo what he had seen, no words that could turn back time. I had no idea how he knew, how he had come home at precisely that moment, but it didn't matter. The truth was there, undeniable and raw, hanging between us like a gaping wound. In that moment, it felt like everything around us, the kitchen, the house, the life we had built together, was shattering into pieces. I stood there, helpless, as the weight of my actions crushed down on me, realizing that the foundation of our marriage had cracked, perhaps beyond repair.